So my name is Lucienne Spencer. I am indeed a postdoc at Oxford at the moment, and my work combines this philosophy of psychiatry, phenomenology, and epistemic injustice. And in my work, I attempt to try to expose some of these obscured injustices suffered by those in the healthcare system, and I explore the ramifications of those. And in today's talk, it's kind of based on some of the ideas for a paper that I'm developing in a special issue in the Journal of the British Society for Phenomenology on the theme of phenomenology of dementia, which is edited by the brilliant Danielle Pethbridge. So keep an eye out for that special issue that I think should be coming out next year. So yeah, these are my general ideas for what that paper is going to be about. So today, I want to demonstrate that for effective dementia care, it's important that we avoid epistemic injustices. So I start with an introduction to the concept of epistemic injustice, and then I'm going to go on to show how people with dementia are systematically subjected to these forms of injustice. I go on to identify a particular form of epistemic injustice that people with dementia are especially vulnerable to, which has been missed in the literature so far. You might have noticed a change in this talk's title from that which I originally proposed. So I originally thought that what I had identified was a kind of intellectual arrogance, but after delving into the intellectual arrogance literature, I've actually decided that that term doesn't quite fit. So I've tried to coin a new term, which is epistemic pedantry, which I think might be a better fit. So I'm going to be putting forward an account of that today, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. I then go on to explore the phenomenological ramifications of epistemic injustice in dementia care. In particular, I'm going to focus on how it elicits shame, as the person with dementia is no longer recognized as a knowing subject. And then finally, I'm going to propose an attitude of epistemic humility, which I think is really important in dementia care. And I think it will contribute towards maintaining the subjectivity of the person with dementia. Okay, so what is epistemic injustice? I'm going to give you a whistle-stop tour just in case this is a new concept. So epistemic injustice was first theorized by Miranda Fricker to, in her words, delineate a distinctive class of wrongs, namely those in which someone is disingenuously downgraded or disadvantaged in respect of their status as an epistemic subject. So the epistemic nature of the injustice derives from a person being wronged in their capacity as a knower, as someone who can convey knowledge. So to be clear, epistemic injustice isn't present in all cases where somebody's credibility is diminished. One can only be said to have suffered an epistemic injustice if the credibility deficit is rooted in an unfair prejudice. So, for example, I might doubt the reliability of a person's testimony if they're a notorious liar. And that would be a fair and rational reason for me to downgrade their credibility. What makes epistemic injustice distinct is that it's motivated by an identity prejudice. And Fricker uses this term to refer to prejudice that's driven by a socially instituted stereotype. In recent years, Fricker's really gone at lengths to emphasize the non-deliberative nature of epistemic injustice. And by this, she means that epistemic injustice isn't this calculated false representation of another person's testimony, which does happen, but that's going to be in a separate category. Rather, it operates in this far more implicit way. And that's why Fricker says that it's particularly important for us to try and identify these cases where there isn't a deliberate conscious manipulation, because those cases are even harder to spot and even harder to name. So one form of epistemic injustice introduced by Fricker is testimonial injustice. She introduces this by using the example from The Talented Mr. Ripley. So Dickie has disappeared, and Marge Sherwood approaches Herbert Greenleaf, which is Dickie's father, to express her suspicions that Tom Ripley has actually murdered Dickie. Herbert Greenleaf, who holds Ripley in high regard, responds by saying, "Marge, there's female intuition and then there are facts." So Herbert dismisses Marge's claim that Tom Ripley might have murdered Dickie as just being female intuition. And then this credibility deficit, Fricker says, is grounded in an implicit prejudice against women's ability to rationalize such matters. Fricker identifies this as an instance of testimonial injustice because the speaker's testimony is given insufficient credibility based on the hearer's prejudice. A further form of epistemic injustice recognized by Fricker is hermeneutical injustice, where hermeneutical resources or language, which is essential for meaning making, is missing from the interpretive framework, so that the subject's grasp of their experience is then distorted or limited or otherwise confined. Hermeneutical injustice occurs when there's this gap where the words to describe a marginalized experience ought to be. To illuminate the wrong of hermeneutical injustice, Fricker presents this hard-hitting example of sexual harassment victims prior to the 1960s. So because certain groups most likely to be targeted by sexual harassers weren't included in the construction of interpretive frameworks in the workplace, experiences of sexual harassment weren't part of the collective understanding. And instead, in the words of Fricker, repeated sexual propositions in the workplace are nothing more than a form of flirting, and their uneasy rejection by the recipient only ever a matter of lacking a sense of humor. So this was prior to the term sexual harassment coming about in the 1960s. Now, given this hermeneutical lacuna, victims of sexual harassment were then incapable of articulating the harm inflicted upon them. Consequently, victims were not only unable to report or discuss sexual harassment, but they also then lacked the hermeneutical resources required to fully grasp the experience themselves. Fricker then refers to this as a kind of cognitive disablement. I'm really interested in hermeneutical injustice and how it links to phenomenology. I've explored that in other work. I think I might end up finding that it's pertinent in cases of dementia care as well, but today's talk is mainly going to focus more on the testimonial injustice side. So why do these epistemic injustices occur? Drawing on Edward Craig's account of the state of nature, Fricker argues that our identification of good and bad informants is key to explaining why we commit epistemic injustices. Craig imagines a social community in its most basic form, whose members seek out knowledge of their environment. And one way of gaining such knowledge is through reliable informants in the social community. To detect reliable informants, we navigate between trustworthy and untrustworthy people. And in so doing, we end up with a conception of a good informant, the knower who we can reliably turn to in the social practice of pooling information. They're the one who's showing up for me. So in discerning which epistemic agents are reliable, the subject subconsciously singles out certain marginalized social groups as being poor informants. And consequently, members of these groups end up suffering a systematic credibility deficit that follows them through different social domains by virtue of identity prejudice. Normally, people aren't judged to be poor informants in every aspect of their life. So an example of epistemic injustice that could track me as a female philosopher, it might be that I'm wrongfully deemed to be unreliable when it comes to talking about metaphysics or symbolic logic, but people might see me as being a good informant when it comes to talking about feminist philosophy because I'm a woman. Sometimes a person can be afflicted by epistemic injustice just in certain domains. Although this credibility deficit might not necessarily affect the subject in every area of their life, it often is systematic. And it's an injustice that can track you through different dimensions of social activity, like economic, educational, political, legal, and so on. And as I'm going to show, unfortunately, in the case of people with dementia, they are often wrongly perceived to be bad informants in almost all domains of their life. And there's almost no domains where they're seen to have an epistemic authority. So people with dementia often suffer these credibility deflating identity prejudices that's attributed to both ageist attitudes, because the risk of dementia rises steeply with age, and the stigma attached to the illness itself. So there's at least a double identity prejudice at play. And there might even be further intersectional identity prejudices to consider, such as the fact of the person with dementia is a woman. People with dementia are often wrongly perceived to be childlike, crazy, not all there, not themselves anymore. And such identity prejudices suggest that people with dementia are, in the words of Kontos, incapable of purposeful and meaningful communication and the pursuit of life-enhancing relationships and activities. The work of epistemic injustice scholars demonstrate how such pathophobic attitudes can fuel a credibility deficit towards people with dementia, so that their testimony is considered to be unreliable, confused, and altogether meaningless. So, for instance, we've got Jongsma et al., who conducted a series of interviews to uncover the credibility deficits suffered by people with dementia in patient organizations. The interviews suggested that solicited testimony from dementia patients is often merely tokenistic. While they might appear to be heard in a formal context, their testimony bears little or no weight on the actual decision-making process. And I've got a quote here from a person with dementia who states that institutions have the attitude that it's me who decides now, me meaning the institution. I do not believe you are able anymore. It's very, very discriminating for the person affected. I believe that this makes him more incapacitated and ultimately turns him into a kind of dementia patient that fits to the typical image everyone has in mind. So that's a clear case of testimonial injustice there. And then in a previous publication, I argued that non-verbal people with dementia can also suffer a form of testimonial injustice too, when their gestures are wrongly misinterpreted as just being meaningless flailing rather than actually being communicative and meaningful. Moreover, there's hermeneutical injustice at play, as reductionist biomedical models exclude the complexity of dementia experiences, and people with dementia are not invited to contribute new ways of making sense of the condition. This is talked about by Jongsma, but it also plays a big role in the work of Danielle Petherbridge as well. Okay, I quickly want to highlight the power relations in the care home before we continue. And this is something that I really wish I thought more carefully about in my last work on dementia. And I think it's an important part when we're thinking about epistemic injustice in dementia context. So I'm going to clarify it here. So behind epistemic injustice, there are these distinct power relations which determine some to possess more credibility than others. And those who have more credibility are understood by Fricker to have social power. And she explains this in the following way. They have a practically socially situated capacity to control others' actions, where the capacity may be exercised actively or passively by particular social agents, or alternatively, it may operate purely structurally. Now, the literature on epistemic injustice in psychiatric healthcare, something that I contribute to frequently, it emerges, these kind of power relations emerge there, where the healthcare professional is perceived to be this privileged clinician who is most likely from a dominant social position, male, white, wealthy, and so on. Now, healthcare workers are, of course, in a position of authority in the care home setting. However, when we look at the dynamics of the care home, those who possess a social power are most often from disadvantaged backgrounds and likely themselves to be subjected to injustices and discrimination. In a study conducted in 2022 in the US by Hickey et al., the following demographics were found, where 80.9% were women, 22.4% were Black women, 12.8% were immigrant women, and on average, they were paid $15.22 an hour. Finding these kind of clear demographics in the UK was a little harder, but in 2020, in the UK, Costello et al. Found that most care staff were female. In the 114 they interviewed, they found that 85.2% were female staff, and 30.4% spoke English as a second language. And staff tend to be low paid and often at minimum wage. So these people who move, these are not people who move through the world with high levels of credibility, epistemic agency, or privilege. Epistemic injustice often occurs in these contexts due to an inability to prioritize aspects such as the epistemic welfare of the resident due to high levels of physical and psychological work. Also, it could be the case that carers of people with dementia outside of the care home are people from marginalized backgrounds as well. So I wanted to clarify this because those who perpetuate epistemic injustices are more likely to often be seen as privileged and having higher epistemic agency. And I think sometimes a more complicated picture ought to be taken into consideration. Now, I believe that a certain form of testimonial injustice in dementia has been missed from the literature, and I'd like to draw it out here. I'm particularly interested in the epistemic injustice that arises from contradicting a marginalized person. In some instances, these kinds of contradictions can be understood as just being testimonial injustice. And I provide an example of a contradiction as testimonial injustice for a person with dementia here. So the interviewer says, "Do you cook food together?" The person with dementia replies, "Yes." Then the husband shakes their head. This is from the paper that I attached to this talk by Landmark et al. And they break down what's happening in this interview segment. And they say, Elvira answers the question with a clear yes, without any hedges or hesitation, thus taking a knowing stance. Immediately, Lenny contradicts Elvira's response by shaking his head, while gazing at the interviewers, taking a similarly strong epistemic stance. The couple is seated side by side, so the head shake is clearly addressed to the interviewers and not the wife, although the action may be in her visual space. Neither the interviewers nor the wife shows any uptake of the head shake, and a long silence ensues. So in this instance, Elvira's testimony is publicly undermined by her husband. If the interviewers decide to take Elvira's dementia to, if the interviewers decide, due to Elvira's dementia, that they're going to trust their husband's testimony or his testimonial gesture of shaking his head over her statement, this is a clear case of testimonial injustice. These are very important instances to expose. However, I'm particularly interested in instances where someone corrects an objectively false claim. So I've got 3 examples I'd like to put forward. Here's one that I witnessed myself in a care home setting. A person with dementia tells a care worker that a certain loved one visited them yesterday. The care worker replies that the resident is mistaken and that this particular loved one has passed away. Here's a second example that I also witnessed. A person with dementia starts wishing everyone a Merry Christmas and singing Christmas songs. A family member informs the person with dementia it's not Christmas. Here's a third example, this time from Hamilton's book, Language, Dementia, and Meaning Making. And this is an interaction with the doctor. The doctor has the medical notes with him, and he's seen that the age of this patient is 89. He says, "Okay, now you've said you're 79. It looks like you're 89, right?" The dementia patient says, "No, I'm really 79. Her husband replies, "No, you're really 89. "I'm really 89. "Yeah." And then she says to the doctor, "Oh, I'm really 89. The doctor replies, "Okay, whatever he says, right? He told it. Anyway, yeah, it's 89. And then continues with the visit. Thus far in the literature, it's focused on cases where testimonial injustice occurs, where a person with dementia is either making a subjective claim about their experiences, or they're making a claim that is in fact true, but has been disbelieved due to some kind of confirmation bias relating to their condition. Or in the previous paper I've written, a form of testimonial injustice occurs where the person with dementia is communicating meaningfully via gesture. But I think these cases of contradiction might have been missed. I want to look at the specific case of correcting a false belief in a person with dementia in a way that induces harm. So although the pursuit of truth, particularly in epistemology, is usually perceived to be this epistemic virtue, I think that this is a unique form of testimonial injustice. And I'm going to attempt to try and put my finger on what that injustice is. As I mentioned previously, at first I thought that these contradictions could be attributed to intellectual arrogance. Tansini defines intellectual arrogance as a disposition to behave in superior, entitled, and irresponsible ways that is grounded on a cluster of self-directed attitudes that function to defend an entity's positive self-conception by gaining or maintaining an illegitimate social status or dominance. She recognizes that these individuals do not intrinsically value knowledge or intelligence. Rather, they value having superior social status, social dominance, because occupying an elevated social position makes them feel good about themselves. There's also a paper by Bottenberg who looks at epistemic arrogance in dementia. To define epistemic arrogance, they say, epistemic arrogance involves being swayed by the presumed authority of one's own beliefs, or more broadly, one's worldview, in a way that hinders relevantly different beliefs or worldviews from appropriately informing one's actions. So Bottenberg then provides a case for epistemic arrogance in dementia, which they argue occurs when others attempt to claim knowledge of the lived experience of the person with dementia. So to quote Bottenberg, in the case of being sensitive to the views and interests of people with dementia, epistemic arrogance comes into play when people not living with dementia think they know what it is like or would be like to have a progressive dementia, remain unreceptive to new or contrasting information, and on the authority of their presumed knowledge, define the scope of knowledge and interests that individuals in dementia can or ought to lay claim to or be understood to express. Bottenberg adds, at the societal or systematic level, epistemic arrogance reinforces biomedical reductionism or the tragedy narrative, a dehumanizing perspective that reduces someone with dementia to their diagnosis, deeming someone lost even while they're still alive. I think that's a really important case that Bottenberg has exposed there, but it doesn't seem to fit the example that I've given of contradicting a false belief. And just a reminder of those there, we've got the care worker informing the person with dementia that they're mistaken and that their loved one has passed away. We've got the family member informing the person with dementia that actually it's not Christmas. And we've got the doctor who can see from the medical notes that Mrs. Sims has got her age wrong, correcting her age. In those cases, first of all, there doesn't seem to be any intentional cruelty or a deliberate attempt to assert epistemic authority. Second, rather than acting on the presumed authority of one's own beliefs, we're looking at cases where the contradicted belief is objectively false. It isn't Christmas, their loved one didn't visit them, and they're not 79, and so on. The corrector does not assume that they know about some subjective experience, such as in the case that Bottenberg put forward as well. They're not presuming that they know more about the dementia experience. According to Tansini, intellectually arrogant people do not intrinsically value knowledge. However, there seems to be, in these cases, valuing of knowledge as the hero corrects a false belief. There's no immediate obstruction of knowledge, although I do concede that it could potentially lead to silencing, like a preemptive silencing if somebody is repeatedly contradicted. But in that moment, there isn't an immediate obstruction of knowledge. In fact, there's this pursuit of the truth which is usually understood as being this epistemic virtue. So what is wrong here then? While we usually consider the pursuit of truth to be an epistemic good, when correcting or contradicting is not epistemically helpful but elicits harm, I think it should be considered a vice. And in this instance, this truth-telling is harmful. There's this prioritizing of truth-telling over the negative impact the truth may have for the person with dementia. I think that we can learn something from Kant's account of scientific pedantry, which has been carefully defined by Axel Gelfert here, as where someone gets carried away with technicalities as opposed to what is useful. In the words of Gelfert, the pedant who slavishly tries to subject everything to established abstract rules before it is deemed admissible lacks a proper orientation towards what matters in the world. I've highlighted that because I think that's particularly important. The pedant tends to lack good judgment as far as the relevance and utility of his endeavors is concerned. So drawing on Kant, I want to put forward an account of epistemic pedantry or being epistemically pedantic. And I argue that this occurs when a person's epistemic status is unnecessarily undermined in pursuit of this trivial truth. In the dementia context, the person with dementia is undermined as an epistemic agent. It's unnecessary that they unnecessarily expose false beliefs, and an epistemic inferiority is established, which exposes these asymmetries of knowledge. In the words of Fricker, as rational agents, undermining one's capacity to give knowledge is to undermine something central to being human. They're degraded qua knower, and they are symbolically degraded qua human. Beyond this epistemic harm, there is, of course, an emotional harm that is elicited from these cases that we've explored. Being told that a loved one is dead repeatedly, having that terrible news broken to you over and over again every time you say, oh, so-and-so is visiting, that's highly distressing. Having false beliefs revealed may also lead to confusion and anxiety. In particular, I believe that shame is a significant phenomenological harm here that I want to explore in more depth. Just briefly, I want to say that I think this vice of being epistemically pedantic might actually occur even beyond the context of dementia. So if you imagine this fictionalized scenario where a well-known activist in racial equality posts online this profound message. This is actually taken from a speech by James Baldwin in the 60s that I really like, but I'm just borrowing it here to illustrate my point. Let's imagine they post online and I suppose that all those cowboy Indian stories are designed to reassure us that no crime was committed. We have made a legend out of a massacre. Then the first reply to this online message is from someone correcting the spelling of committed. While it's true that there's an epistemic error here, exposing and correcting this epistemic error, perhaps even inadvertently, asserts an epistemic authority, a superiority of the corrector, and the epistemic inferiority of the speaker. Too much care is given to this trivial epistemic good of spelling over other important considerations, such as the overall message of the speaker. Okay, now I think that epistemic pedantry may appear to be a better fit for some of the cases I've put forward than others. For example, I can see that some people may be reluctant to attribute epistemic pedantry to the case of telling the person with dementia that their loved one has passed away. It is, of course, worth observing that a hearer might correct the false belief because they might feel like doing otherwise would be to deceive the hearer. Pretending that the loved one is still alive might feel deceptive. It is, of course, not a trivial truth that their loved one has passed away. However, I think that it could be argued that telling the truth in this instance is trivial in comparison to how much harm it will create for the person with dementia, who will repeatedly be exposed to the shock that their loved one has passed away. So personally, I do still want to squeeze that case into the scenario. I want to squeeze that scenario into this category of epistemic pedantry. However, I think that I could also offer the term epistemic insensitivity, which I define as occurring where a person's epistemic authority is unnecessarily undermined in a pursuit of a truth that causes more harm than epistemic good. However, I'm going to stick to epistemic pedantry for now, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about this in the Q&A section. But first, when is contradicting a false belief not an injustice? So if there's an instance where correcting a false belief actually reduces distress, this isn't an injustice. So I've experienced this where a person with dementia thought it was their birthday, but then nobody had called or visited or sent birthday cards. In this instance, I corrected them, say, actually, it's not your birthday today. And that actually reduced the distress. Also, instances where the truth serves as a practically important role and would prevent harm. So if you imagine correcting a person with dementia who's informed a paramedic that they haven't taken their daily medication yet when you're aware that they have. Okay, so in what follows, I will explore how epistemic injustice in the dementia context leads to a profound phenomenological harm of shame, where a person is no longer recognized as a knowing subject. I focus on epistemic pedantry here, but I do think that these phenomenological ramifications can emerge through other forms of epistemic injustice too. Okay, so first I need to begin with an account of recognition. As embodied subjects, we operate within a world that we understand to be shared with other embodied subjects. We don't experience others in the world in the same way that we do inanimate objects. We witness that others in the world must possess a subjectivity like my own, in virtue of the fact that they engage with the world in much the same way as myself. Merleau-Ponty provides this example that I really enjoy. He says, I am watching this man who is motionless in sleep, and suddenly he wakes. He opens his eyes. He makes a move towards his hat, which has fallen beside him, and picks it up to protect himself from the sun. What finally convinces me that my sun is the same as his, that he sees and feels as I do, and that after all, there are two of us perceiving the world is as follows. When the man asleep in the midst of my objects begins to make gestures towards them, to make use of them, I cannot doubt for a moment that the world to which he is orientated is truly the same world that I perceive. Merleau-Ponty recognizes that he and the other share a common world as they're simultaneously impacted by their environment. Merleau-Ponty recognizes in the other's gestures that they experience, in his words, the bite of the world. I love that phrase. This symmetry is enough to convince him that the other is moved and touched by the same world, and as such is an embodied subject positioned in the world much like himself. So now I'd like to try to marry Merleau-Ponty's account of recognition of the other with Fricke's account of social perception of the epistemically charged. So according to Fricke, Fricke's not a phenomenologist, by the way. She is the person who coined epistemic injustice, and she's very much in the social epistemology area. But I feel like everything is infused with this kind of phenomenology, particularly this account of being epistemically charged. So according to Fricke, we register a speaker as being epistemically charged through a kind of social perception. I imagine that this is kind of like a radar where certain people show up as being epistemically reliable, or they appear in epistemic color, as I've put it elsewhere. As previously discussed, identifying reliable and trustworthy informants serves this basic urge that we have as epistemic agents to try to pool information and to gain knowledge from our environment. So certain people will show up as epistemic agents in this social perception, and they show up as epistemic agents like ourselves. Now, other people will fail to register. And now I'm going to look at those cases where people fail to register on this epistemic radar. So to better understand the harm that's elicited when someone fails to register, I'm going to turn to Sartre and his account of shame And I'm going to be drawing heavily here on the work of the brilliant Luna Dolzal, who's a scholar dedicated to understanding the phenomenology of shame. Dolzal defines shame as connected to one's core self and identity. It concerns a transgression, fault, or flaw that will lead others to think less of who one is. So Dolzal delineates three structural components to shame. There's the self, the other, and a norm or a standard that has not been met. And shame arises when the self is witnessed by the other transgressing or failing to live up to the norm in question. Shame can be elicited in a variety of ways for people with dementia, especially as sadly they're often placed in objectifying and dehumanizing positions. People with dementia could even be argued to experience what Dolzal calls as a chronic shame, this pervasive or persistent shame that tracks a person with dementia through multiple areas of their life and creates a horizon of shame where one anticipates shame-inducing experiences. The shame that I'm going to be talking about here is unfortunately but one of a milieu that people with dementia are subjected to. However, this form of shame that I'm talking about, I don't think has been identified in the literature yet. I think that there's a form of shame that emerges from being publicly exposed as epistemically fallible and having one's epistemic status publicly diminished. And there's an awareness that the other has this diminished perception of the person of dementia as an epistemic agent. And then this is in direct contrast with the epistemic agency and superiority of that other person. So to use Dolzal's language, we're concerned with the shame that arises when the self is witnessed by the other transgressing epistemic norms. As we can see from the following quote, not being able to live up to epistemic norms can make people with dementia feel profoundly foolish and useless. So Joe says, you can feel an idiot then, really. Supposing somebody asked me, is such and such a shopping, and I would find myself completely at a loss and completely useless. So again, drawing on Dolzal, we can consider the gaze of the other as articulated by Sartre. So for Sartre, there is being for itself and being for others. As a being for itself, there is a subjective transcendence. The objective experience of the body is pushed to the periphery of one's attention. If you imagine a philosopher typing a paper on their laptop, absorbed in writing, she doesn't focus on her fingers tapping on the keys, but rather she experiences her body as this subjective I that it is expressing philosophical thought. In contrast, you've got the being for others, the seen body, which is objectified under the gaze of the other. And upon Sartre's recognition of himself as an object for others, he also recognizes, I exist for myself as a body known by the other. Sartre experiences his body as a seen body under the other's objective look. So for Sartre, through the gaze of the other, one is forced to evaluate oneself through another's eyes. I am offered to the other's assessment, Sartre says. For Sartre, this triggers a transformation into a being of vulgarity, clumsiness, and ugliness. Sartre acknowledges that this perceived evaluation can be provoked. It can provoke a range of emotions such as irritation or anger. However, at its core, the gaze of the other motivates shame. So this is a quote from Sartre. Shame in its primary structure is shame before somebody. I have just made some clumsy or vulgar gesture. The gesture sticks to me. I neither judge it nor blame it. I simply live it. I actualize it in the mode of the for itself. But now, all of a sudden, I raise my head. Somebody was there and has seen me. All at once, I realize the vulgarity of my gesture in its entirety, and I am ashamed. One can imagine that this could be a common occurrence for people with dementia, particularly as dementia is more common in those who are older. There's an introduction of what Javi Carrel calls bodily doubt, where the body no longer functions in a way one expects or can trust. The body that was once at the periphery of one's attention is now at the forefront as this unpredictable, potentially even alien vessel that can't be relied on in the same way as it could before. And from this emerges, bodily functions that one can't control and a difficulty to perform tasks that were once habitual. And these gestures have been shown to be shame-inducing for people with dementia. In what follows, I'm going to argue that such shame can also be induced by these public displays of epistemic infallibility. Fallibility, even. In an instance of shame, you have a realization that the other doesn't recognize you as a subject. Your subjectivity is profoundly diminished in the eyes of the other. In the cases that we've examined here, this judgment occurs due to the person acting in a way that's contrary to the manner in which a knower is meant to act. By making the speaker aware of the epistemic mistake, it's much like making them aware of a vulgar gesture. Speech expressions, according to Merleau-Ponty, after all, are a kind of gesture in themselves. The person with dementia says with vigor, "Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year," and you reply, "It's June." This false belief has been exposed to the other, and there is this elicitation of shame as the inaccuracy of the claim is realized. Rather than being recognized as vulgar or clumsy, the person is recognized as being epistemically fallible, which is perhaps even more significant to one's sense of being a fellow human being. In this moment, the speaker realizes that they're not an epistemic agent in the eyes of the other. Petherbridge observes that interpersonal recognition is a fundamental aspect of dementia care. In cases of epistemic injustice, the person with dementia is not showing up as a viable epistemic agent in the other person's social perception. And the person with dementia is aware of this, and they're aware that they are falling short of being recognized as a knower, an important aspect of being human that we hold in high regard. Now, to be clear, I don't think that epistemic fallibility makes you any less human or should impact someone's recognition as being a fellow human being. What I'm saying is that being a trusted knower is wrongly perceived to be this incredibly important characteristic. And therefore, when someone isn't recognized as a knower, this is shame-inducing. So I argue that an epistemically just approach is essential for good dementia care that recognizes and values the subjectivity of the person with dementia. But what does that really mean? We might get on the right track, I think, by looking at Landmark in the paper that I attached to this talk and how they characterize epistemically just ways of correcting people with dementia. Because I'm coming to time, I might not read through this completely, but there's an instance where, so Landmark proposes this more symmetrical distribution of epistemic rights. They say that this was achieved when the partners invited the person with dementia to correct or revise their claim, thus giving them the opportunity to self-repair. There's this example of Gary and Laura being the person with dementia. She's talking about what happened to her in the care home, and she just says that, "Oh, we had lunch." Gary says, "Oh, maybe a little bit more than lunch." And in doing so, Gary's using this fishing device to encourage Laura to expand on what she's already said. He's not contradicting what she said, but he's prompting an expansion. And Landmark sees this as a good way to allow Laura to keep her epistemic authority. However, unlike the cases of contradiction we've been exploring, it only seems to be appropriate when the person with dementia has not been making a false belief claim, but rather has just missed some information. Landmark also puts forward this other case. This is a clear case of contradiction. Laura says that her father was a twin, and Gary definitively says, Laura says that her father wasn't a twin, and Gary says, yes, he was, contradicting her. Because there was a silence after this contradiction that allowed Laura to consider whether or not she was correct, she then corrects herself and says, actually, he was a twin. Landmark says that her epistemic authority was retained. And I think that might be the case, but I don't think that's thanks to Gary. I think Gary still did commit an epistemic injustice. And if there hadn't have been that pause, there still would have been, it would have undermined the epistemic authority of Laura. So I think it would be helpful to think about maybe a different epistemic attitude that we ought to adopt in dementia care. So just quickly, we need to be sensitive to contexts where correcting is unhelpful and establishes epistemic asymmetries that produce distress and shame. And I believe the virtue we ought to aim for is epistemic humility. I argue that epistemic humility is essential for the interpersonal recognition proposed by Petherbridge. And here I'm going to argue that epistemic humility is another important virtue for this end. And it'll help alleviate the ontological structures of shame that we discussed. So Medina defines epistemic humility as having a humble and self-questioning attitude towards one's cognitive repertoire, which can lead to many epistemic achievements and advantages, qualifying one's beliefs and making finer-grained discriminations, identifying one's cognitive gaps and what it would take to fill them, being able to formulate questions and doubts for oneself and others, and so on. So I argue that the concept of epistemic humility ought to be expanded to include a humble attitude towards the importance of epistemic correctness in certain contexts. It should include an attitude, it should include an attunement to what actually matters in a given context and an awareness of when truth is useful. And in this case, it's not this humility about one's own knowledge, but rather humility regarding knowledge itself. Also, we require this humility regarding what counts as being an epistemic agent. We need to expand that to include people who can sometimes be epistemically fallible, but still have broader ways of being able to communicate meaningfully. So such epistemic humility recognizes and fosters the subjectivity of the person with dementia, as it is sensitive to the desubjectifying impact of epistemic injustice. I think that will then maintain a subjectifying relationship with the person with dementia. Okay, so just to summarize, epistemic injustice in dementia, including epistemic pedantry, elicits a phenomenological harm. A profound harm of epistemic injustice is shame, whereby the person with dementia is aware that they're not being recognized as a knowing subject. And epistemic humility is an essential attitude to be adopted in dementia care to foster the subjectivity of people with dementia. Thank you.